Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. I'm your host, Wedge. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. Please make sure you press that follow button, as well as check out other episodes here on the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. Today's episode is going to be the 10-minute report Vikings. And if you guys are unfamiliar, which you shouldn't be by now, the 10-minute report series is where I am dropping a video every single day of July for a different team, where I take 20 minutes of study plus my already established knowledge to create a 10-minute podcast. So with all that being said, let's jump into today's episode, the 10-minute report on the Minnesota Vikings. Starting off with quarterback Kirk Cousins. Their offense had a lot of success last year behind a couple star players and Kirk Cousins, who performed well. Last year, Cousins had 4,547 passing yards, 29 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and all of that on just 65.9% completion percentage. So Cousins obviously had himself a pretty solid year. If you guys haven't checked out the Netflix series Quarterback, it goes into a kind of a behind-the-scenes look on a couple quarterbacks, and Kirk Cousins is one of them. So that's kind of cool to see. Kirk Cousins seems like a very good, humble, down-to-earth quarterback. So moving on, one of his main contributors to Kirk Cousins' numbers was Justin Jefferson, who had 1,809 yards and 8 touchdowns last season. Justin Jefferson also led the league in receptions with 128 of those. And all this was good enough to get him Offensive Player of the Year honors, as well as making the first team All-Pro. None of this comes as a surprise, as Justin Jefferson has been a top-notch wide receiver for the past couple of years. Arguably the best wide receiver in the league. I will share my take on that in an upcoming episode of on the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast, where I break down the top 5 wide receivers, so stay tuned for that. And then they also have wide receiver KJ Osborne, who had a solid season as a number 3 behind Jefferson and Adam Thielen. KJ Osborne had 650 yards and 5 touchdowns. And then they also traded for TJ Hawkinson before the deadline last season. And Hawkinson had, between the Lions and the Vikings last year, had 914 yards and 6 touchdowns. So like I said, they lost Adam Thielen. He signed with the Carolina Panthers. And the Vikings decided to draft wide receiver from USC/Pitt, Jordan Addison, 23rd overall in the draft in April. Addison had himself a good career at USC, and one year at USC, his third year, and then 2 years at Pitt beforehand. In those 3 seasons, Jordan Addison had 3,134 yards and 29 touchdowns. So definitely, I would say Addison, if he's able to perform, close to his college numbers, I would say Addison is probably a step over Adam Thielen's production the last couple of years. They also lost running back Dalvin Cook. They cut him, I believe, for a salary cap, and Dalvin Cook has had 4 straight years of 1,000 plus rushing yards. So Dalvin Cook's going to be a big loss. But the Vikings management and offense seems to be have good belief in running back Alexander Mattison, who signed a 2-year, $7 million deal to stay with the Minnesota Vikings. Last year, he had 283 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns with the Vikings. Obviously, that was second fiddle to Dalvin Cook. And then their offensive line, I would say, is between the top 10 and the top half of the league in terms of productivity and efficiency and all of those things like pass protection and run blocking. Look for them to be able to maintain that offensive line status somewhere between, bordering top 10. If you don't put them in your top 10, I would definitely say top half of the league in terms of offensive line. So, moving on to the defensive side of the ball, their defense, with the exclusion of their pass rush, their defense is pretty bad. Last year, mostly the secondary is at fault for a lot of their defensive failures and, getting exposed, like the New York Giants football game last season in the playoffs. I believe that's who they lost to. Daniel Jones had himself a game picking apart the Vikings DBs. But last year they had the second most passing yards allowed as a defensive unit. And they definitely noticed this weakness and decided to make a very concerted effort for that in the offseason. First, they signed free agent cornerback Byron Murphy Jr., who was most previously in Arizona. He signed with a 2-year, $17.5 million deal. Last season, he had 36 tackles, 4 passes defense, and 3 tackles for a loss in just 9 games. So Byron Murphy has been a very good corner past couple of seasons, and I would project that a healthy Byron Murphy is able to do that again and hopefully lead the turnaround, hopefully for the Vikings fans, hopefully lead a turnaround in their defensive secondary unit. And then they also used up a couple of draft picks on cornerbacks as well, selecting cornerback Mekhi Blackman, 102nd overall out of USC, and cornerback Jay Ward, 134th overall out of LSU. Blackman had 66 tackles, 3 interceptions, and 12 passes defense last season for the Trojans. And then Jay Ward had 59 tackles, 1 interception, and 4 passes defense last year with the LSU Tigers. Moving on to their edge rushers, who was their only strong point on the defense last season because of that poor secondary. They had edge rusher Daniel Hunter, who last year had 65 tackles, 10.5 sacks, and 12 tackles for a loss. Very good numbers, 10 sacks, over 10 sacks from him. And then they also had edge rusher Zadarius Smith, who had 44 tackles, 10 sacks as well, and 15 tackles for a loss. So between those two guys, as edge rushers, they already had over 100 tackles, 20-plus sacks, and 27 tackles for a loss. And then they also decided to sign edge rusher Marcus Davenport, who was most recently with the New Orleans Saints. Last season for them, he had 29 tackles, half a sack, and 2 tackles for a loss. But definitely a notable name. And Marcus Davenport, if I'm not mistaken, has had higher production than that in years prior. So that is pretty much all of the notes I have for the Vikings. Last year, I do believe they were a very good team, but I think their record showed up better than they were or should have been, if you would have taken a look at it or compared, player versus player, position versus position for each game. But one thing that the Vikings were able to capitalize on last season and, really put them in that position to have those 12 or 13 wins that they had was their ability to win one-score games. I believe they were like 9-0 or something like that in the regular season in one-score games, one possession, being defined as 8 points or less. And that is some of the benefit of having a solid, above-average quarterback like Kirk Cousins. Yes, he gets a little bit of slander for not being able to win in primetime games, but there's no doubt about it that Kirk Cousins is one of the better half quarterbacks in the league and has been for a while here. So that wraps up my 10-minute report on the Vikings, which leaves me with just one last thing, and that is my 2023 season record prediction for the Minnesota Vikings, where I predict that they will go 11-6. Thank you all for listening to the 10-Minute Report Vikings. Once again, it'd be greatly appreciated if you would follow me here on Spotify, as well as check out my Instagram at Wedge52Gridiron. Thanks all for listening once again, and go Ravens.